beautiful song, Ya'aleh Ve'yavo by Keepa Live. That's from the prayers that we say at the beginning of each Hebrew month. We just entered a couple days ago the new month of Heshvan. And so we ask that God will bless everything that's coming to us in this month. Excuse me. How are you, my holy brothers and sisters? Let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us on this lovely Tuesday? Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina, Carol from Cleveland, Paula from Chicago, Vaughn from Ohio. If this is your first time, let us know so we can welcome you. Randy from Florida, Stephen from New Hampshire, still trying to sort out who can renounce their rights to whom from yesterday. Yes, we will sort that out today. Pam from Nashville, Jennifer from Missouri, Charles Abraham from Clovis, New Mexico, Jacqueline from Mounds, Oklahoma, Mark from Manchester, England. Welcome, welcome. Must be late for you, Mark. Sage from Sequoia National Park, James from Indianapolis. Bill says shalom. Question for fun. Okay, we'll get to that question later. It looks complicated. Rochelle says it's darker now in Modesto. The seasons are changing indeed. Tom from Pennsylvania. Quom says, hey, I'm in from Chad and I love Israel. Wow, welcome, Kum Rankley from Chad in Africa. It's so great to have you. And we love that you love Israel. Welcome to AT Daily. Nancy from Detroit. Melissa from New York. Mark says invite him to a barbecue, answering Bill's question. Barbara says hello from Orlando. Guy from Ohio. Amir is with us with a gift that I can't see. Stephanie says shalom aleichem. Scott says shalom from Ohio. I've missed a lot of live shows. So glad to be here for this one. Lou from Modi'in in Israel. Welcome, Lou. Leah from Miami. Ryan is buried under 7 inches of October snow in the Twin Cities. I had no idea. Wow. Wow, it's winter already in Minnesota. Ruth from Paris. Paris, France or Paris, Texas? Welcome, Ruth. Pam says, glad you were able to make it. Amir from Miami. Roseanne from Asheville, North Carolina. Tom says, go Dodgers. Amen. Go Dodgers. They're playing right now. This is how much I love you guys. I'm teaching our class rather than watching the Dodgers in Game 1 of the World Series. Narendra is with us saying hello. Carol says, yep. Mark says, hello, not Jewish, but interesting. You have permission to share my courtyard. Beautiful, Mark. And from Merced, Narendra is with us from India. Welcome, Narendra. It's so great to have you with us. And anyone over there? Yes, on the YouTube side, Mirasia from Atlanta, Georgia, Linda from North Texas, and Deborah Hazelwood from Florida. Welcome, everybody. Today's daf, first of all, it's going to continue what we started to learn at the end of yesterday's class. We're going to answer a question, and I really enjoyed this daf. It's just got a lot of people speaking in a sequence that makes a lot of logical sense, so we can really follow the argument. You know, they're not bringing in so many references that it's so difficult to follow like sometimes. So this one, let's turn on our big brains and follow the logic as the sages, it's like a bunch of them are weighing in from different generations, but clarifying an issue, and it's like the logic is always moving forward. This was a fun one. So where are we? We are in chapter 6 of Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. This is chapter 6, very much about renouncing one's rights in an eruv so that other people can carry. We are going to complete our discussion of Mishnah number 2 and open, and I think even complete our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Is that right? Yeah, and we're gonna finish Mishnah number 2 and open and close our discussion of Mishnah number 3. We are on Daf Ayin Aleph. That's page 71 of Tractate Eruvin. All right. So we've been discussing the general concept that if multiple houses share a courtyard, they must all join in an eruv so that the people who live in those houses in the shared courtyard can carry objects in and out of their houses into that courtyard, or from the courtyard back into the house, or just carry something around the courtyard more than 4 cubits. In order for that to work, they all have to join in an eruv. Basically, they all deposit a little bit of food in a communal basket that is stored in one of the houses in the courtyard. If one of the residents of the courtyard doesn't join in the eruv, he's going to restrict everyone from carrying objects in and out of their houses or through the courtyard on Shabbos. Why? Because there's a resident in that courtyard who has rights in that courtyard, but who didn't join the eruv. So it's like the people who are in the eruv are sharing with the public, as it were, because somebody else has rights besides their shared rights in the eruv. So this person who forgot to join the eruv or just didn't join the eruv, for whatever reason he didn't join the eruv, he's going to render the eruv invalid. And now no one can carry on Shabbos in that courtyard, even though they joined in the eruv, because the one guy who was left out. However, the sages arranged a cure for this situation. The one who didn't join the eruv may no longer join the eruv on Shabbos. Once Shabbos begins, it's too late to join the eruv. But he may renounce his rights in the courtyard. He will not be able to carry objects in and out of his house to the courtyard, but the rest of them will. Why? Because when he renounced his rights, it's like there is no other member of the public, as it were, who shares that courtyard with the people who created the eruv, so nobody restricts them. They can carry. Yesterday, we examined the case of a resident in this courtyard who dies. He dies, and then somebody inherits his property. And so the question is, the one who inherits the property didn't join in the eruv. He didn't even own the property when the people created the eruv, let's say on Friday afternoon. But then after they created the eruv, one of the people, let's say one who did not join in the eruv, he would restrict the people, and then he dies, so he can no longer renounce his rights in the courtyard, so because he's dead. So the question is, once he dies and his heir inherits his property, may the heir renounce his rights in the courtyard? And as we saw yesterday, Rav Nachman says yes, the one who inherits may renounce his rights. And let's say that in Hebrew, because it's so interesting how Hebrew grammar works. In English, when we have a verb, right, we would say he may renounce or he may not renounce his rights. In Hebrew, we would say he is mevatel, right? So mevatel is like a verb. It functions as a verb, but what we're actually saying is he is one who may renounce, or he is one who may not renounce. And that's why when you hear, sort of experienced people teaching these concepts, they will very often, when they use the word that seems to mean the verb to renounce the rights, right, to make a bittul reshus, to renounce one's rights in the courtyard, in the domain, but you would say he can be mevatel, or he is mevatel, right? He is mevatel. So the heir can be mevatel. The heir can renounce his rights in the courtyard, according to Rav Nachman. But the disciples of Shmuel say no, he may not be mevatel. He may not renounce his rights in the courtyard. So this is the discussion that we were doing at the end of yesterday, and there's going to be three objections to Rav Nachman's point of view. Rava brings the first one, the first challenge, and it's a baraisa to challenge Rav Nachman, which says that something which is permitted when Shabbos begins at sundown on Friday remains permitted throughout Shabbos. Something that is prohibited when Shabbos begins remains prohibited. So what he's talking about is, for example, if you have this situation that a few courtyards merge together in a shituf mavoy, right? In other words, they merge the alley. So this is the situation which we're going to be talking about momentarily. Imagine there's multiple houses in each of these courtyards, and they have joined in an eruv, not just within a courtyard, but they're joining the courtyards so that everybody can carry in this alley. And as we learned at the very beginning of Tractate Eruvin, in order to carry in this alley, which, by the way, would have to not be open on both sides, right? It would have to be closed on one side. But over here at the entrance, they would need either a side post or a cross beam across the top, but like overhead, right? So let's say that this has a side post as the marker that all these courtyards have joined in an eruv for the alleyway. That's called a shituf, a merging of the alley, so that all the people in these courtyards can carry out of their courtyards into the alley, over into another courtyard, throughout the alley in all three courtyards. And that would be indicated by this side post at the opening of the alley. If this side post fell down during Shabbos, so the marker which is required is no longer there, would then the carrying that's permitted throughout this whole space be canceled? And the answer is no, according to this baraisa that Rava is bringing to challenge Rav Nachman. If the side post falls, because carrying was permitted when Shabbos began, carrying remains permitted throughout Shabbos. If, for example, the side post wasn't there when Shabbos began, and then somebody comes along and puts the side post there during Shabbos, shouldn't do that, but say someone did, that's not going to be enough. It was prohibited when Shabbos began. It's going to remain prohibited. Now, it's kind of funny to bring this kind of a baraisa as evidence about this heir, that he was not in a position to be mevatel, his rights in the courtyard. He was not in a position to renounce those rights in the courtyard when Shabbos began, because he hadn't inherited yet, right? The one who owned and didn't renounce his rights was still alive. Then he died. Then this guy inherited, and so this baraisa is being brought as evidence that the condition which existed at the beginning of Shabbos remains in effect through Shabbos. So the guy was not in a position to renounce when Shabbos began. He's not going to be allowed to renounce after he inherits. It's funny to use that in the case of eruv, because we do have a condition which we can change after Shabbos begins. Namely, all the residents of a courtyard who joined in an eruv, but one guy was left out, they cannot carry when Shabbos begins. But if he renounces his rights, then they can carry. And that is the exception that proves the rule. Somebody can renounce his rights and render the courtyard permitted for carrying to the other people that he restricted until he renounced his rights. But other than that, if carrying is permitted at the beginning of Shabbos, it remains permitted. If for these other reasons, these other physical reasons, there's not going to be a change of status. So says Rava to Rav Nachman, so for the case of your heir, since he could not have joined the eruv yesterday, and he did not have the ability to renounce his rights before he inherited, he's not going to be allowed to renounce his rights after he inherits. That is going to be a challenge, which is going to fail. But that's the challenge that Rava brings. The second challenge is from another baraisa. And in this case, we have a situation where a Jew and a Jew by choice, right? So somebody it doesn't really matter whether the first Jew is a Jew by choice or not. The situation is not about him. So there's a Jew in this courtyard, and there's another Jew in this courtyard, and the second Jew is a convert. The reason that it matters that he's a convert is that under the law of inheritance that stood in ancient Israel, when everything was by Torah law, one who converts to Judaism leaves his non-Jewish family behind, right? He converts to Judaism, then he's able to acquire property in Israel. If he dies without children that he had, or a Jewish woman that he married after he became a Jew, well, they inherit his property. There's no problem. But if he dies before he gets married and before he has children, So then he doesn't have Jewish family. And the land that he bought in Israel, this is in ancient times, will not be inheritable by the family that he had before he converted. So in that situation, the land becomes ownerless. Ownerless until somebody comes along, a Jew comes along and acquires it, right? So if you're aware in ancient Israel that there's this guy who converted to Judaism, doesn't have a family, he's on his deathbed, it's like everybody's going to get ready to acquire that property because it has to go to another Jew. It can't go to the non-Jewish family he had before he converted. So a Jew and a Jew by choice share this courtyard, let's say, and the Jew by choice, the convert, dies on Friday before Shabbos begins. So in this baraisa, it says that even if a Jew acquires the property, nevertheless, we may not carry. Right? So let's think of the situation. There's two Jews living in this courtyard. So they have to make an eruv in order for them to be able to carry there, because there's two of them, not one. You don't need an eruv when it's just one house in one courtyard. But where there's two residences in a courtyard, they have to enter into an eruv so that both of them will be permitted to carry on Shabbos. They didn't enter into an eruv. One of them died. The Jew by choice died. Now, it would seem like there's only one Jew living in that courtyard, so he should be permitted to carry. He doesn't need an eruv. There's only one of him. But this baraisa teaches us that carrying is not permitted even if a Jew comes along and inherits acquires that property, and now there's two of them. And then it also says that if the Jew by choice dies after Shabbos begins, then even if no Jew acquires the property, carrying remains permitted because it was permitted when Shabbos began, and it stays permitted. So the Gemara immediately says, wait a minute. This baraisa, which is being used to disprove Rav Nachman's contention that the heir, right? This is a little bit similar to a Jew who comes along and acquires ownerless property, a little bit similar by analogy to somebody who inherits property from his father, let's say. And it's being used as an analogy to show that guy's not going to be able to renounce his rights. But the Gemara immediately says, wait a minute, before we go on to see how this baraisa applies to Rav Nachman's contention, the baraisa itself is difficult. Why does it say even if a Jew acquires carrying, when the Jew by choice dies before Shabbos begins, it says even if a Jew acquires that property, carrying is going to be prohibited in the courtyard. Why does it say even? If no one acquires the property, carrying should be permitted as there's no one there to restrict the other Jew. Why are we saying that even if somebody comes along and acquires, carrying is not going to be permitted? The even would imply that for sure carrying is not permitted if the Jew doesn't come along and acquire that ownerless property. So Rav Papa says, well, actually, we've misstated the baraisa. It should have been worded, the first clause should have said, even if a Jew did not take possession of the ownerless property, carrying would be prohibited. And the Gemara says, well, wait a minute, you can't just change the baraisa because it's inconvenient the way that it's worded. Rather, what this baraisa is coming to say is that if the one who has no heirs dies, and so that property is going to be left ownerless, and somebody's going to come along and become its new owner. The fact that he died before Shabbos began means that there is a possibility, perhaps even a strong possibility, that some new person will come along and acquire the property. And since there's going to be a new person who comes along and who for sure did not join in the eruv, he is going to restrict carrying for the other one, the one who was living there all along and did not die. And if he died on Shabbos, if the convert died on Shabbos and left the property ownerless, well, as we saw before, it's not going to matter. Carrying was permitted at the outset of Shabbos. it would seem that in this case, it's permitted because they were in an eruv, right? They had entered into an eruv, and that's why carrying is permitted. And it was permitted at the outset of Shabbos, and it remains permitted. So the Gemara says, but why does this new Jew, right, the new one who comes along and acquires the ownerless property, why does he restrict the other one from carrying? He should be mevatel, the rights in the yard. He should renounce his rights in the courtyard, and then the one who was living there all along and didn't die will be permitted to carry there on Shabbos. And Rav Nachman answers, exactly. That's what it means that the new Jew restricts. He restricts the other one from carrying until he renounces his rights, until he is mevatel his rights in the courtyard. And at that point, the first one will be able to carry. And that's why Rav Nachman says this is not a challenge to his position. It proves his position that the heir can renounce rights in the courtyard, even though he acquired them after Shabbos began or before Shabbos begins. He can renounce his rights no matter when he acquired, but he can renounce his rights on Shabbos, says Rav Nachman. And Rabbi Yochanan supports this position and says, well, who is the Tana, who is the rabbi of the earlier generation, who says that the heir, the one who inherits property on Shabbos, cannot then renounce those rights in favor of the other members of the courtyard so that they can carry in there on Shabbos? Who says that an heir cannot renounce his rights? Answer, Beis Shammai, right? The Academy of Shammai were the ones who said that until when can anybody, even a resident of the courtyard, until when can they renounce their rights in the courtyard for carrying on Shabbos? Until Shabbos begins. After Shabbos begins, it's too late. They can no longer renounce their rights. Who disagrees with them? Beis Hillel, the followers of Hillel, who say, no, even after Shabbos begins, you can renounce those rights. That is the cure for having a person who didn't join the eruv and screws it up for everybody else. But now he can renounce his rights even after Shabbos begins, per the opinion of Beis Hillel, the followers of Hillel. Get this in front of me. And Ula says, the reason that Beis Hillel permit one to renounce his rights in the courtyard after Shabbos has begun is because this is not akin to an acquisition. When he renounces his rights in the courtyard, it's not that the other members acquire rights on Shabbos. He renounces his rights in favor of them, but it's not like they have acquired, like they purchased something on Shabbos, which would be prohibited on Shabbos. We don't do business transactions. We don't buy and sell property on Shabbos. But, says Ula, this is not an acquisition. It's not a purchase and sale of like an easement of rights in real property. Rather, this person always intended to join the eruv, and something got in the way and he wasn't able to do it. So now that he renounces his rights, he's simply demonstrating the intent that he had all along. Abaye says that's a little attenuated. That's a little bit difficult. We have a simpler way to understand it. The reason that a person can be mevatel his rights in the courtyard, the reason a person can renounce his rights in the courtyard after Shabbos begins is because they're not acquiring something from him. He's simply withdrawing himself from the shared domain. It's as if he just left. And so there's no acquisition that would violate the spirit of Shabbos. Rather, he allows them to enjoy Shabbos by removing himself from sort of taking part in it. It's not like he has to physically leave the yard, but in renouncing those rights, it's like he withdraws from the domain. And that completes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Now we're going to start Mishnah number 3. It's a new idea. Questions and comments, put them in the comments. We're moving fast, and we'll get to those pretty soon. All right, Mishnah number 3. Here in chapter 6 of Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. This is a short Mishnah. If a homeowner was in partnership with his neighbors, with this one in wine and with that one in wine, they need not establish an eruv, for due to their authentic partnership, they are considered to be one household and no further partnership is required. Let's illustrate that with this figure. Okay, so here what we have is 3 courtyards that share an alley. Now, none of these people need an eruv with themselves to carry just within their courtyard, because these are single family residences, each in a private courtyard. But the 3 courtyards open into a shared alley. Now, for them to be able to carry objects on Shabbos from this guy's house, he exits out into the alley and wants to carry something over to this guy's house, or from this guy to here, or from this guy all the way to there, for carrying to be permitted throughout this little, sort of cul-de-sac arrangement, the 3 courtyards that open into the shared alley, they all need to make an eruv with each other. Let's say take a basket of food, all 3 deposit some food in the basket, and it gets stored in one of their houses on behalf of everybody. But they forgot to make an eruv. So they forgot to make an eruv. Okay, it's too late. They can't carry. They can carry in their own courtyards, but they're not going to be able to take, a bottle of wine or a gift or something over, a gift of food over to his house for Shabbos lunch, because they can't carry in the alleyway. That's not going to be permitted. This is considered like a public domain, not a public domain, but like a public domain, because multiple people have rights in it, and they didn't enter into an eruv together. But according to this Mishnah, there's actually a backup plan. There's a plan B, only because of a situation that already existed before Shabbos began. Namely, they're not only neighbors, it turns out that they're business partners. These are business partners, and what are they partners in? As Rabbi Sruli Bornstein says, commodities. They buy and sell merchandise. What do they buy and sell? Perhaps they buy and sell wine. So this guy has he co-owns wine with this guy. B and C are partners, and they own a barrel of wine together. They bought an expensive barrel of wine. They're going to hold it for a few years. They hope it's going to age well, and then they're going to sell some of it and drink some of it. And it turns out that B and A also went partners in a barrel of wine. Let's say that B is a big wine merchant, and at one point he says, hey, I'm getting this really awesome barrel of wine from France. It's amazing. You want to go partners with me? He said that to C. Yeah, let's do it. So they're partners in one barrel of wine. And at a different time, C wasn't home, and B mentioned to A, hey, you know what? I'm buying this really great barrel of wine. Do you want to be partners with me in it? Yeah, let's do it. And so they bought another barrel of wine together. It's important to understand that A and C, they're not partners with each other. They each have individual partnerships with B, okay? And they own one barrel of wine together, and so let's say like that. One barrel of wine and another barrel of wine. All right. And so they have a shared barrel and they have a shared barrel. And let's say that both of these barrels are being stored somewhere on B's property. Okay. And I'm not even sure about that. But let's assume, for the argument's sake, that the wine is deposited at B's house. Okay. So by virtue of the fact that he has a partnership with C and he has a partnership with A, they do not need to establish an eruv, because effectively they've already created one. And by virtue of these pre-existing business relationships, these two partnerships that B has a partnership with C, B has a partnership with A, he's storing these partnership-owned barrels of wine on his property. It's like they all have an eruv together, and everybody can carry throughout this space. Now, that's saying a lot, because normally when you create an eruv, right, it's like everybody has to deposit some food, usually bread, into one basket to create an eruv that covers all three places. Now there is no one basket. right? It's just two separate barrels, it would seem, and it's going to create an eruv, even though, and usually to create an eruv, you have to have intent to create an eruv, right? Somebody goes around, hey, we're making an eruv. Will you put some food in the basket so you're in the eruv? Yes, I will. Here you go. And everyone is, consciously creating an eruv. Here, they didn't do that. They just happen to have these partnerships in place, and our Mishna says they're going to be able to rely on that to create an eruv. Second paragraph says, if, however, he was in partnership with this one in wine and with that one in oil, then they must establish an eruv. They don't have an eruv, right? So if it turned out that A and B have wine together, but let's do it like this, but B and C have oil, right? This is wine, this is oil, then it's not going to work. Everybody has to be in the same product, which is right now not unclear if wine specifically or just wine as an example, that they're all in the same product. But if this partnership is in wine and this one is in oil, according to the second paragraph, it's not going to work. They do need to create an eruv, and so they're not going to be able to carry since they didn't create an eruv before Shabbos began. However, Rabbi Shimon says, in both this and that case, in other words, even if he partners with his neighbors in different items, one with wine and the other with oil, the eruv is established. They're not missing an eruv. This business relationship, the two business relationships, is going to be enough to create a virtual eruv that we can rely on and they can carry throughout these properties. So it's saying a lot. It's surprising. We're a little bit surprised by this Mishnah. And so right away, a bunch of rabbis are going to step up quickly and start limiting what seems like a ruling that's a little bit surprising in its leniency. Now, it's not that surprising that we're going to find a leniency in the realm of eruv, because eruv, as we've seen many times, it's a rabbinic decree for the purpose of enjoying Shabbos. There was a limitation on our ability to enjoy Shabbos in King Solomon's time, when they said that you can't carry out of your house into a shared courtyard because it's like a public domain. You must join in the eruv. But having said that, the rabbis tend to interpret eruv cases leniently. Nevertheless, you can't be too lenient. So let's see what the different rabbis are going to say about this Mishnah. Okay, so Rav right away says, okay, well, let's talk about the case where it's wine and wine. Not oil, right? So it's wine and wine. But according to Rav, he may have separate partnerships, B with A and B with C, but all of the wine needs to be in one barrel. Just one barrel. It can't be in two separate barrels. It all has to be mixed in one barrel. His partnerships with A and with C, separate partnerships, but the wine is all in one container, says Rav. Rava says, exactly, Rav is right, and we can get that from a close reading of the language of the Mishnah. Because why else would it say that it works if it's wine, but it doesn't work if it's wine with one deal and oil with the other? It must be that they have to be mixed because otherwise it wouldn't work. In other words, it only works because they're all in one container. All the wine is in one container. And if it's wine and oil, which you can't put in one container, that's why it doesn't work, because it's not in one container, says Rava. Abaye says to Rava, no, actually that's no proof. It may be that the reason it has to be wine with both partnerships is not that it is all mixed up in one barrel, but that it's prepared for mixing. It's suitable for mixing, not that it is in fact mixed. It doesn't have to be mixed, but since an eruv is supposed to be one, right? When people deposit food in an eruv, it's in one basket. Here we have two separate baskets, and somehow it's going to create one eruv for all three courtyards. So Abaye is saying, okay, it might be in two containers, but it's like, we're saying as if they're gonna be mixed, as if they're mixed. They may not actually be all mixed into one container, but they have to be suitable for mixing in one container, and wine and oil would not be suitable, and that's why it works if both partnerships are in wine, and it does not work if one of the partnerships is in wine and the other partnership is in oil, according to Abaye. Rabbi Shimon says, and as he rules elsewhere, What's actually happening here is that the reason that this works is because the guy in the middle can make a separate eruv with, he can make one eruv with that guy and one eruv with this guy, and carrying would be permitted, from here to there, from there to there, and it wouldn't restrict the idea that you can carry from here to there and from here to there. Now that's usually in a case where there's an entrance between the courtyards, right? Rabbi Shimon's case is where it's like this. The three courtyards all connect with each other, and then maybe he can make a separate eruv with this and a separate eruv with that, or maybe not, right? It's a little bit unclear what Rabbi Shimon is saying there. And Abaye says, no, that's no comparison. Because what you're actually talking about is that he could make a separate eruv with A and a separate eruv with C, and he could carry like that, and maybe they could carry into here, although it's problematic since they'd be mixing in a courtyard. But you can't compare that case to our case, because even though there's two separate partnerships, it's going to create one eruv for all of them, not two independent eruvs that the middle one happens to be a part of both eruvs. There's only one eruv, so don't compare to that other case, says Abaye. Rav Yosef says, okay, actually, what's going on here is this. It is a single vessel. Yeah, it's wine and wine, and it's all in one vessel. But actually, it's not wine and wine. It's all in one vessel, even though he has a partnership with A in wine, and he has a partnership with C in oil, but the wine and the oil are all in one vessel. It's like, what? How could wine and oil be in one vessel? Wouldn't you want to keep those separate? But wine and oil don't really mix. If you have oil in a barrel and wine in a barrel and you're careful, the oil is going to ride on top, the wine is going to ride on the bottom. So even though they share one vessel, it's two separate foods, and you could use them as two separate foods, although they share one vessel. And that's why Rabbi Shimon permits this thing to happen. It's not about making separate eruvs. It's about the fact that wine and oil, two separate partnerships, can be contained in one vessel because wine and oil don't mix so readily. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says, actually, even if it's wine in both partnerships, it's not going to work. He's going to have to make an eruv. They're going to have to establish an eruv and not rely on this pre-existing business partnership. And so since they didn't establish an eruv, carrying is going to be prohibited on Shabbos. Now Rava comes and explains Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai's position. Why is he arguing with the rabbis who said this works? That because there's a pre-existing relationship, as long as it's wine and wine, according to the rabbis in the Mishna, even though they're separate, it's going to create the virtual eruv for all of them. They can carry throughout all three. And remember that in the original situation, it's like this. Okay? So says Rava, now the reason that Eliezer ben Tadai is going to object and says it doesn't work at all. Rava explains, unless A and C, when they come over, when they made their partnership with B, they brought the wine that is going to be, that they're going to be partners with B on it, and they pour that wine into the single vessel. And C has, a barrel of wine that he owns in partnership with B, and then he's going to pour it into that vessel. And it's all going to end up in one vessel, but it came separately, and it only got mixed after it was brought by the partners who lived A and C. So if they did that, then Eliezer ben Tadai would say, okay, very good, the eruv has been established. But if it was already mixed up, or it wasn't in one vessel, according to Eliezer ben Tadai, it wouldn't work. According to the rabbis, it does work all in one vessel. Why? Because that concept that we've already learned of retroactive designation. It's two separate partnerships, and they have to be kept separate, even though they're mixed in one barrel. Well, later, when they go to sell the wine, right, they bought it together, they're hoping that it appreciates in value, and later they're going to go sell it. And at the time, they remove, the first load that they're going to sell because of the AB partnership. Okay, so even though it's been sitting there mixed together, when they remove it, we're going to retroactively designate that even at this time when they relied on it as an eruv, it was already that portion of the wine owned by them. And likewise, later when they sell the BC the B and C partnership portion of the wine, when they sell it later, we're going to retroactively designate that what they sell later, that was their portion of the shared partnership that was in the single vessel that they relied on for the purpose of the eruv. So that's how Rava explains Eliezer ben Tadai's objection that this isn't going to work and they need to establish an eruv, and why the rabbis who disagree, the rabbis of the Mishna, say that it does work. Rav Yosef comes and says, well, no, you guys are misunderstanding. The reason that Eliezer ben Tadai requires an eruv and says that this system doesn't work is because the courtyards open to each other, right? So it's not that they can only merge an alleyway, and that's why they're going to create this eruv together so they can go through the alley over to each other's houses. Rather, there are also entrances in the walls like this that connect the alleys. And Eliezer ben Tadai is objecting because in a situation where they can merge courtyards without merging the alleyway, if they want to, they must. He's saying that because they have a possibility of merging courtyards without using the alley, they need to merge the courtyards and not rely on merging the alleyway. They need to do both, according to Eliezer ben Tadai. And the rabbis who disagree with him say, no, you don't have to do that. It's enough to make one eruv for the whole area, including the alley. You don't have to make separate eruv for the fact that to accommodate the fact that you're merging courtyards as well as merging an alleyway between three courtyards, says Rav Yosef. And he relies to explain this on Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says to establish an eruv between courtyards, when you're establishing an eruv between courtyards, you can't do that with wine. It can only be done with bread. Whereas an alleyway, that may be merged with wine. You can use joint ownership of wine to merge courtyards in an alleyway. But when you're merging two courtyards or three courtyards together directly without using an alleyway, that requires bread. Usually, if you imagine like an alleyway can have many more courtyards and many more people involved, and so they're going to be more lenient and allow different kinds of products. But when it's immediate neighbors who share, courtyards and a door and a wall between the courtyards, it's like the sages were more particular, and they said you need to do that with bread. Bread is required for that kind of an eruv, according to Rabbi Meir. And then the question is, well, if you're merging the courtyards, why would you merge the alleyway? And if you didn't merge the courtyards, why isn't it enough that you merge the alleyway? Why can't we rely on the merger of the alleyway, even though you also have the possibility of merging the courtyards through these doors? And the answer to that question is because the sages didn't want the laws of eruv to be forgotten. So they wanted people who have a shared courtyard. Since there's a door here, it's essentially like two residents in a shared courtyard or three residents in a shared courtyard because these doorways make it like all one big courtyard. And so they need to do that with bread. And even though it's possible to merge through the alleyway and rely on that in certain situations, the sages didn't want the law of eruv to be forgotten, so they required that in this situation they do an eruv with bread, according to Rabbi Meir. The rabbis who dispute Rabbi Meir say, no, that's not necessarily necessary. We can rely on the merger of the alleyway, and that is enough. That's what the rabbis said. Rav Yehuda says, but actually the law follows Rabbi Meir. Rav Huna says, no, the law was not established according to Rabbi Meir, but the custom was established according to Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yochanan said, no, the custom was not established according to Rabbi Meir, But the people became accustomed to do like what Rabbi Meir said. So the law should have been, according to the rabbis, that you don't need to make this basket of bread eruv when you might be joining using wine and using the whole alleyway. But the people just came to do that, and the rabbis said, well, let them keep doing it. It's nice. The law of eruv won't be forgotten, and it's a benefit that the neighbors get to know each other better because they're depositing bread in smaller groups to join their courtyards. And ultimately, what is the halacha? This is the last thing I'm going to read to you, and then we'll answer comments and questions. With regard to an eruv and a merging of alleyways. If a merging of alleyways was established with bread, there is no need to establish an eruv for the courtyards. However, if a merging of alleyways was established with wine, then an eruv must also be established for the courtyards, as the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, so it became more than just the custom, it did become the law, as interpreted by the first explanation of the Gemara. Now, this ruling is either due to the ruling of the Gemara or because Rava explicitly stated that one may rely upon this merger of alleyways. Now, Rava talked about that in the case where there was a bris, a circumcision on Shabbos, and the water that they needed to bathe the child before the circumcision spilled, and they needed to bring some warm water. And then Abaye said to him, we didn't merge the courtyards. And he said, all right, so let's rely on the merger of the alleyway. And then Abaye said, yeah, we didn't merge the alleyway either. And then Rava said, oh, okay, we'll have a non-Jew bring the water, and then became a whole other discussion. But as we saw, they had both, right? Merging the courtyards and merging the alleyway. It just hadn't been done in that case, but both could reasonably be expected to have happened. Now, some commentaries say that it is permitted to rely on the merging of alleyways to permit carrying between the courtyards via the opening between them only if each courtyard had already established its own internal eruv, but had not established an eruv between the courtyards. So that's saying that in each of these courtyards, there's two houses, right? So now each courtyard would have to make an eruv in the courtyard, and they had a big merger for the alleyway, then they wouldn't need to make the bread eruv between these courtyards, is what this ruling is saying, according to some commentators. And the Rima maintains that one is permitted to rely on a merging of alleyways instead of an eruv, even if it is established with wine, and he explains that in modern times, all the residents contribute wine to the merging, and therefore it is considered to be both an eruv and a merging of alleyways. So as we see, there's sort of a lot of different ways to skin the cat. And at the end of the day, what the Mishna said about these business partnerships, it works, right? An eruv between partners who participated in a partnership in wine with one who participated in a partnership in wine with each of his neighbors need not establish an eruv. So the holding of the Mishnah does hold up even in modern times. That is the law. All right, let's get to comments and questions. Right, so Bill Eldridge, Shalom, question for fun. We let a local farmer, an old friend of mine, hunt on our land in exchange for help maintaining it, and he just bagged his first deer of the year. What's the appropriate blessing? Well, perhaps just being thankful for food on the table. Truthfully, deer hunting is never going to produce kosher meat, right? Because deer is a kosher animal. So if you were able to trap it without hurting it, and then shecht it, slaughter it properly, then it would become kosher meat that you could eat. But if you shoot it dead, if you hunt it with a gun or a bow and arrow, it would be a nevela. It would be a carcass that is not permissible to eat. But that's just for a Jew. Bill, you've shared with us before, you're not Jewish. So you should enjoy that venison. I hope it's really tasty and you barbecue it and enjoy it so much. And and just thank God that you've lived to see this day and enjoy that meat with your friends and your neighbor. Tom Beck, the eruv lasts until the wine or oil is gone. Presumably, yeah. Then they don't have that partnership in the wine anymore. That's why very often eruvs rely on matzah, right? Matzah is bread. It's just very flat, unleavened, bread that never tastes that good but never goes bad, and so it can just hang out there for a long time, and you don't have to worry that somehow the eruv doesn't exist anymore. Sharon says, don't folks put varied items into the common basket? Why should that be otherwise with two types of food with the business partnerships? It's a great question. It seems to be, why doesn't it work? Because it all goes in one vessel. Even though he has separate partnerships in the wine, like they own a certain amount of wine together, but all of the wine is being held in one vessel, in one barrel. And that's why it would seem that wine and oil, it wouldn't work, right? Because you wouldn't put wine and oil in one vessel together. But then it turns out you could put wine and oil in one vessel together, either because they could be stored together and still remain distinct foods that had not been ruined through the mixing because the oil sits on top of the wine, or because you deposited them together in order to mix them on purpose because there was some kind of a drink made of wine and oil. So I guess what is being said there is like you could put various foods in the basket, but if putting them in together kind of ruins them and renders them, not usable anymore, then you would not have an eruv. It seems like that's what they're saying. Sharon, can people who are not in business partnerships make an eruv with bread and a beverage, or as we discussed before, vinegar? How does it happen in that circumstance? Well, I think what happens is when you're making an eruv, you're doing it on purpose. So sure, somebody in the basket could put a bottle of wine, and somebody else could put a loaf of bread, and somebody else could put in some other food, and then it's all in that basket together. Here, they didn't intend to make an eruv. They forgot to make an eruv, but it turns out that they had this business partnership going, and that's why, maybe they could rely on it, but there were going to be, certain conditions placed on that lucky situation that they happen to be partners. And finally, Mark Price says, if you and your neighbors share a non-physical commodity like an internet provider or a religion, could you cut through all the complexity about suitable containers? Who has the authority to say what is a suitable container for the Talmud? I think that in terms of the fact that you co-own something else, let's say you co-owned a shed where you both kept your garden tools, that would not create an eruv, because an eruv is based on a meal, right? Maybe it's a liquid meal, as it were, but it seems that it needs to be based on food. Creating an eruv together, there needs to be some kind of joint deposit of food. And so I guess a shared internet provider, a shared router, or something like that, or a shared garden shed would seem not to qualify for that leniency. That's what I've got for us today. Tomorrow, we're definitely going to aim to start on time. I know that I sometimes have trouble starting on time, but believe me, it's because I'm just I start earlier and earlier each day, but then I just, I got to get this stuff organized, and I'll try to do better. I really want to start at that 6 p.m. start. Tomorrow, we're going to do a double page. Today, we did page 71, Ayin Aleph. Tomorrow, 72 and 73. Because number one, they're short pages and they lend themselves to doing a double. And number two, because I'm actually going to be unavailable. I'm actually going to be a little bit out of town, just driving out of LA a little bit on Thursday. Plus, I think there's some big event, some big political event Thursday evening. So a good time for that coincidence to happen. So double page tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time. No class on Thursday, and then back to the regular schedule on Friday at noon Pacific before Shabbos. My holy brothers and sisters, you should be blessed with a great evening, a great week, and a great month, and a great year. All the best.